The auctioneer's voice echoed across the gravel lot as dozens of farmers, bankers, and land investors gathered beneath the gray Iowa sky. Opening bid, $180,000. Paddles shot into the air almost instantly. One bid followed another. The numbers climbed so quickly that most people stopped counting. Near the back of the crowd stood a woman, wearing a faded denim jacket. She held a small brown envelope so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Inside that envelope was exactly $500. Nothing more. No one noticed her. No one imagined she had come to bid. Yet before the day was over, every person standing at that auction would remember her name. But to understand why she was there with only $500, we have to go back several weeks, back to a farm where hope was disappearing, one unpaid bill at a time. Spring of 1984 arrived late in Jasper County, Iowa. The fields should have been alive with the sound of tractors preparing the soil, but many sat abandoned. The American farm crisis had reached nearly every family in the county. Interest rates had climbed. Crop prices had fallen. Banks were calling in loans that farmers had no chance of repaying. Every week, another auction sign appeared beside another gravel road. For lifelong farmers, those signs meant more than losing land. They meant losing family history. They meant losing identity. On a modest 160-acre farm outside the town of Newton lived 34-year-old Sarah Whitmore and her two children, Emily and Jacob. Just 3 years earlier, Sarah's husband, Thomas, had filled those same fields with laughter. He believed every difficult season would eventually pass. Then a tractor accident changed everything. Thomas never came home. From that day forward, Sarah became mother, father, accountant, mechanic, and farmer all at once. Neighbors admired her determination, but admiration didn't pay bank loans. Every morning before sunrise, she milked the remaining dairy cows. She prepared breakfast for the children. She drove the old tractor into fields that seemed larger every season. Every evening, she studied unpaid invoices beneath the dim kitchen light, while pretending everything would somehow work out. The children noticed more than she realized. 10-year-old Emily quietly stopped asking for new school clothes. 8-year-old Jacob offered to skip lunch, so there would be more food for everyone else. Sarah smiled whenever they looked at her. Then she cried after they fell asleep. One rainy afternoon, the mail carrier handed her another certified envelope. She already knew what it contained. The First National Bank had issued its final foreclosure notice. Unless the outstanding balance was paid within 30 days, the Whitmore farm would be sold at public auction. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it, because she couldn't believe 3 generations of hard work could end in a single paragraph. She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the same wooden drawer where she had hidden every overdue notice. When Emily entered the kitchen moments later, Sarah forced a smile. "Everything okay, Mom?" Sarah nodded. "Just another bill." Emily wanted to believe her. Instead, she quietly noticed tears Sarah hadn't wiped away quickly enough. That evening, Sarah walked through the barn after feeding the animals. She placed one hand on an old wooden beam Thomas had repaired years before. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered into the silence. Only the wind answered. A week later, the bank manager, Harold Benson, visited the farm personally. Harold wasn't an unkind man. He had grown up nearby. He knew every family facing foreclosure. But policies were policies. "The auction has been scheduled for June 18th, he said gently. "I'm sorry, Sarah." She looked across the fields where Thomas had taught Jacob to drive a small tractor. "There has to be another way." Harold lowered his eyes. "I've tried everything I legally can." As he drove away, Sarah remained standing in the driveway until his car disappeared beyond the hill. The children watched from the porch without saying a word. News spread through Jasper County faster than anyone expected. At the local diner, farmers discussed which investors planned to attend the Whitmore auction. One name kept coming up: Richard Hawthorne, the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties. Hawthorne had spent the past 2 years buying distressed farms one after another. Some people admired his business sense. Others believed he was taking advantage of families at their lowest moments. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. If Richard wanted a property, he usually got it. When Sarah heard he intended to attend the auction, the little hope she still carried began to fade, because she knew no ordinary farmer could compete with his money. Still, every evening she walked the property with Emily and Jacob. They talked about the apple tree Thomas planted the year Emily was born, the fishing pond where Jacob caught his first bass, the weathered red barn built by Sarah's grandfather in 1937. Every corner of the farm carried memories. Selling it felt like erasing the family itself. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning Thomas's old workshop, Sarah discovered a dusty metal box hidden beneath a shelf. Inside were faded receipts, handwritten notes, family photographs, and an envelope with Thomas's handwriting across the front. For Sarah, she stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a short letter. "If you're reading this, life probably didn't turn out the way we planned." She paused, struggling to continue. "I hope you never measure your worth by the size of this farm. The land matters because of the people standing on it. Promise me you'll keep believing in people, even when life gives you every reason not to." Tears rolled silently down her face. Folded beneath the letter were 5 crisp $100 bills. Thomas had saved them years earlier for an emergency. Sarah held the money carefully. $500. It wasn't enough to stop a foreclosure. Not even close. But somehow it felt like Thomas had reached across time just to remind her she wasn't alone. She placed the money back into the envelope. She had no idea what she would do with it. She only knew she couldn't spend it on groceries or bills. It meant something more. As the auction day drew closer, investor trucks began appearing around the county. Rumors spread that the Whitmore land contained some of the richest soil in central Iowa. Several investors planned to compete aggressively. Sarah listened to the gossip without responding. Deep inside, she made one quiet decision. She would attend the auction, not because she believed she could outbid anyone, but because she couldn't bear the thought of staying home while strangers decided the future of the only place her children had ever known. On the evening before the auction, Emily asked softly, "Mom, are we really going to lose the farm?" Sarah looked out the kitchen window at the fading sunset. After a long silence, she answered honestly, "I don't know." She reached into the drawer and picked up Thomas's envelope one last time. $500. A promise. A memory. And somehow, the only thing she still had left to carry with her into tomorrow. The morning of June 18th arrived with a heavy blanket of fog stretching across the rolling fields of Jasper County. Sarah Whitmore barely slept. Long before sunrise, she stood on the front porch holding a steaming cup of coffee she never drank. Every corner of the farm looked different that morning, not because the land had changed, but because she feared it might be the last time she would see it as home. Inside the farmhouse, Emily carefully folded the blankets on her bed, while Jacob silently packed a small cardboard box with his favorite toy tractor, a baseball glove, and a faded family photograph. Neither child asked where they would go after today. Sometimes children understand difficult truths long before adults admit them. Sarah finally walked back inside. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go." She reached into the kitchen drawer and picked up Thomas's envelope. 5 crisp $100 bills. Nothing else. She slipped it into the pocket of her denim jacket. Not because she believed it would save the farm. Because somehow carrying it made her feel as if Thomas was walking beside her. By 8 o'clock, trucks and sedans had filled the gravel lot outside the Whitmore property. Auction day had become something of a public event. Local farmers leaned against pickup trucks, discussing crop prices. Bank representatives reviewed paperwork beneath a white canvas tent. Wealthy investors arrived wearing polished boots that looked as though they had never stepped into fresh mud. The atmosphere felt strangely divided. Some people had come to buy. Others had come simply because another family was losing everything. Sarah stepped out of her aging pickup truck with Emily and Jacob at her side. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Several neighbors quietly removed their caps as she walked past. Old Mr. Collins, who farmed the neighboring land for over 40 years, approached her slowly. "I'm sorry it came to this." Sarah forced a small smile. "So am I." He reached into his pocket and handed Jacob a shiny silver dollar. "Your grandfather once gave this to me after helping repair my combine. I think it belongs with your family." Jacob looked toward his mother. Sarah nodded. "Thank you." The old farmer tipped his hat before walking away, wiping moisture from the corner of one eye. Across the lot, a convoy of black luxury vehicles pulled in. The conversations immediately shifted. Richard Hawthorne had arrived, tall, confident, and dressed in an expensive tailored coat. Hawthorne carried himself like a man who already owned the property. Behind him walked two attorneys, a financial advisor, and his assistant carrying folders filled with property documents. He barely glanced at the Whitmore family. To him, this wasn't a family tragedy. It was another business acquisition. One investor whispered to another, "That's the end of it. No one's going to outbid Hawthorne." "I heard he doesn't even have a spending limit today." Sarah heard every word. She lowered her eyes. Deep inside, she reminded herself why she had come. Not to win, just to witness the end with dignity. The auctioneer climbed onto the wooden platform shortly after 9. His voice echoed across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for attending today's foreclosure auction of the Whitmore family farm." The words struck Sarah harder than she expected. Not the Whitmore property, not acreage, not farmland. The Whitmore family farm. Hearing those words spoken aloud made everything painfully real. The auctioneer continued, "The property consists of 160 acres, including a farmhouse, dairy barn, grain storage facilities, equipment sheds, and water rights." He paused. Opening bid. The crowd fell silent. $180,000. Almost instantly, paddles shot upward. 190. 200. 210. The numbers climbed with breathtaking speed. Sarah barely recognized the voices. They blended into one continuous rhythm. 220. 230. 240. Each bid felt like another memory being taken away. Jacob reached for her hand. She squeezed it tightly. Emily quietly stared at the farmhouse, trying to memorize every detail. Within minutes, only 4 serious bidders remained. Richard Hawthorne, a farming corporation from Des Moines, a land investment group, and an elderly farmer named Walter Jenkins. Walter had hoped to expand enough land to support his 3 sons. But everyone knew he couldn't compete for long. The bidding reached $300,000. Walter slowly lowered his paddle. He shook his head. His wife placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. One by one, the remaining investors dropped out. Soon only Hawthorne and the corporation continued battling. The numbers climbed higher. 320, 335, 350. Finally, 360,000. Silence. The corporation representative sighed. He lowered his paddle. The auctioneer looked around. "Any further bids?" No response. Going once. Sarah closed her eyes. Going twice. Just before the hammer fell, a quiet voice broke the silence. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. It was Sarah. The crowd stared in confusion. She stepped forward slowly. "I'd like permission to ask one question before the auction ends." The auctioneer hesitated. Harold Benson, the bank manager, nodded. "You may." Sarah looked directly at the auctioneer. If someone wanted to bid, would they have to pay the entire amount today? Several investors exchanged puzzled glances. The auctioneer answered professionally. "No, ma'am. A certified deposit is required today. The remaining balance follows according to the auction agreement." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Richard Hawthorne smiled slightly. He assumed she misunderstood how auctions worked. Sarah reached into her jacket. She removed Thomas's envelope. Carefully, almost reverently. She held it against her chest for a moment before speaking. "I have $500. Laughter erupted from several investors near the back. Someone whispered loudly, "She thinks $500 buys a farm." Another chuckled. "This isn't a charity sale." Sarah remained perfectly still. She wasn't embarrassed. She simply looked at the auctioneer. "I know it isn't enough." The laughter slowly faded. "But is it enough to register as a bidder?" The auctioneer looked toward the bank representatives. Harold Benson adjusted his glasses. "Technically, yes. The deposit requirements depended upon the percentage of the opening bid, not ownership of the entire amount." $500 met the minimum registration amount. Harold nodded slowly. "Yes." The entire crowd fell silent. Even Richard Hawthorne looked surprised. The auction clerk accepted Sarah's envelope. She was handed a bidding paddle. Number 27. Emily stared at her mother. "Mom?" Sarah smiled gently. "I told you your father believed in showing up." The bidding resumed. $360,000. The auctioneer looked across the crowd. Any advance? For several long seconds. Nothing. Then, Sarah slowly raised paddle 27. Gasps spread through the audience. The auctioneer blinked. 365,000. Richard Hawthorne turned around. His expression shifted from amusement to curiosity. He raised his own paddle. 370. Sarah raised hers again. The crowd erupted into whispers. What is she doing? She can't possibly afford this. Has she lost her mind? Harold Benson watched silently. He knew Sarah. She wasn't reckless. She had a reason. He simply couldn't understand it. The bidding continued. 375, 380, 385. Every single time Hawthorne increased the price, Sarah answered. Not immediately. Never emotionally. She always paused, looked toward the farmhouse, then quietly lifted paddle 27. Richard's confidence slowly disappeared. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one challenged him, especially not a woman carrying only $500. He leaned toward one of his attorneys. Find out who is backing her. The attorney quickly moved through the crowd asking questions. Minutes later, he returned. No one. What do you mean, no one? She came alone. Richard frowned. Impossible. No bank would finance someone already facing foreclosure. No investor would partner with a bankrupt farmer. Then why keep bidding? The price crossed $400,000, a number few believed the Whitmore property would ever reach. Local farmers looked at each other in disbelief. Some secretly smiled. For the first time in years, someone had forced Richard Hawthorne to fight for every dollar. But Sarah's face never changed. Inside, her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the auctioneer. She knew something no one else did. She wasn't bidding because she expected to own the farm. She was buying time. Time for something. Or someone she prayed would arrive before it was too late. Only one other person in the county knew what she had done 3 days earlier. And if he failed to appear, everything would end today. The auctioneer called once more. $425,000. Richard Hawthorne lifted his paddle without hesitation. 430. Every eye in the crowd slowly turned towards Sarah Whitmore. She looked down at the worn envelope that had belonged to Thomas. Then across the gravel road. A cloud of dust was rising in the distance. Someone was driving toward the auction. Fast. Sarah whispered so quietly that only she could hear it. Please, don't be too late. The vehicle grew larger. But from where the crowd stood, no one could yet see who was behind the wheel, and neither could Sarah. The cloud of dust grew larger. Every head in the crowd turned toward the narrow gravel road leading to the Whitmore farm. The engine echoed across the open fields before the vehicle finally came into view. It wasn't another luxury sedan. It wasn't a bank vehicle. It wasn't one of Richard Hawthorne's attorneys. It was an old white Ford pickup covered in road dust, pulling a worn livestock trailer behind it. The truck rolled to a stop near the auction tent. For several seconds, no one moved. The driver's door opened. A tall man in faded overalls stepped out, removing his cap as he looked across the crowd. Some of the older farmers recognized him immediately. Is that David Miller? It can't be. David Miller had grown up in Jasper County before moving to Nebraska nearly 15 years earlier. He and Thomas Whitmore had been best friends since childhood. After moving away, David built a successful agricultural equipment company that repaired and restored machinery for struggling family farms throughout the Midwest. Few people in Jasper County knew how successful he had become. Even fewer knew why he had returned. David walked directly towards Sarah. She looked at him with tears already forming in her eyes. You came. He smiled gently. I promised Thomas I would. The crowd fell silent. Richard Hawthorne folded his arms. What is this about? David turned toward the auctioneer. I apologize for arriving late. The auctioneer nodded. Can I help you? David reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded an old yellowed envelope. "I believe this concerns today's auction." He handed the envelope to Harold Benson. The bank manager adjusted his glasses and slowly opened it. Inside was a signed agreement dated 1979. Harold's expression changed instantly. He looked back at David in disbelief. "This is—" David nodded. "Thomas and I signed it 5 years ago." The crowd leaned closer. Harold cleared his throat before speaking. "It states that if either family ever faced foreclosure because of death or financial hardship, the surviving partner would have first right to purchase the property before outside investors." Richard Hawthorne interrupted sharply. "I've never heard of such an agreement." Harold remained calm. "Neither had I." He continued reading. The document was filed with the county clerk but was never attached to the loan records. He looked toward Sarah. "It appears no one thought to search for it until 3 days ago." Richard frowned. 3 days ago?" Sarah nodded quietly. "When I found Thomas's letter, I also found a receipt from the county clerk." She looked at David. "I didn't know what it meant." David continued. "She mailed me a copy of that receipt. I drove to Jasper County immediately. I spent the last 3 days searching county archives. I found the agreement yesterday afternoon." A murmur swept through the crowd. Richard's attorney stepped forward. "We'd like to examine that document." After several minutes of careful inspection, he finally nodded. "It's genuine." Richard's confident smile disappeared for the first time that morning. The auctioneer looked toward Harold. "What does this mean?" Harold answered carefully. "It means Mr. Miller has legal priority to purchase the property before any outside bidder." Richard's jaw tightened. "So all this bidding," David smiled politely, "raised the value." Several farmers chuckled. For the first time all morning, the tension began to lift. Richard looked directly at David. "Can you actually afford this farm?" Without saying a word, David handed Harold a certified bank check. Harold examined it. His eyes widened. "It covers the full purchase price." The crowd gasped. Richard slowly lowered his bidding paddle. For the first time in years, he had lost. Not because someone had more money, but because someone had honored a promise. The auctioneer struck the wooden gavel. "Sold." The sound echoed across the fields. Sarah closed her eyes. Emily wrapped both arms around her mother. Jacob cried openly. The Whitmore family had not lost their farm, but the greatest surprise was still to come. David walked toward Sarah, carrying the signed paperwork. She smiled through tears. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." He shook his head. "You already have." Confused, Sarah looked at him. David glanced toward the old red barn. "When my father lost everything back in 1972, Thomas hired him. He paid him wages, even when he barely had enough money for his own family." Sarah listened quietly. "He never told anyone." David continued. "When I left Iowa with almost nothing, Thomas loaned me enough money to start my repair business. I tried to pay him back. He refused. He said," David smiled, "one day someone else will need it more than I do." Many people in the crowd quietly wiped away tears. Thomas had planted seeds of kindness years earlier. Today, they had finally come home. David looked at Sarah. "I've waited 12 years to repay that debt. But there's one condition." Sarah laughed softly through her tears. "What is it?" "You keep farming." The crowd applauded. But David wasn't finished. He turned toward the gathered farmers. "I didn't drive here alone." He motioned toward the livestock trailer. Instead of livestock, several brand new pieces of farm equipment were secured inside. A restored tractor, hay equipment, replacement parts, generators. David smiled. "My company restores equipment farmers can no longer afford. I've brought enough machinery to help 5 struggling farms this season." Silence filled the air. Then old Walter Jenkins stepped forward. "I'll volunteer my combine." Another farmer raised his hand. "I'll donate seed. I'll provide fuel. I'll repair fences. I've got spare cattle panels." Within moments, dozens of farmers began offering equipment, labor, livestock feed, fencing supplies, and volunteer time. Richard Hawthorne watched in complete silence. He had arrived expecting to buy another farm. Instead, he had watched an entire community become stronger. Old Mr. Collins walked toward him. "You know, you could still leave here with something valuable." Richard looked confused. "What?" "Your reputation." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked toward Harold Benson. "I'd like to withdraw my remaining offers on the neighboring foreclosure auctions." Several investors stared at him. Richard continued, "And I'd like to establish a loan fund." The crowd looked stunned. No publicity, no announcements, just lower interest financing for family farms that still have a chance. Harold blinked. "Are you serious?" Richard nodded. "I've spent years buying land." He looked across the Whitmore farm. "Maybe it's time I started helping people keep it." Months passed. The harvest that autumn became one of the most memorable Jasper County had ever seen. Volunteers worked side by side across neighboring farms. Children laughed from wagon rides filled with pumpkins. The old Whitmore barn received a new roof. Fresh paint covered weathered fences. Emily once again talked excitedly about college. Jacob proudly drove the restored tractor beside his mother. And every Sunday afternoon, David returned to the farm for dinner, not as a businessman, as family. One crisp October evening, Sarah stood beside Thomas's favorite oak tree, watching the sunset spread across fields of golden corn. She removed the worn envelope from her jacket, the same envelope that had once held $500. She smiled. Those 5 bills had never purchased a farm. They had done something far greater. They had reminded her to believe in people when giving up would have been easier. She folded the envelope carefully and placed it inside a small wooden box with Thomas's letter. Years later, whenever visitors asked how the Whitmore farm survived the farm crisis of 1984, Sarah always gave the same answer. It wasn't saved by money. It was saved by a promise. Because sometimes the greatest harvest a farmer leaves behind isn't measured in acres, bushels, or bank accounts. It's measured in the kindness planted in other people's lives. And when those seeds finally grow, they can save far more than a farm. They can restore an entire community.